The Lord of the Rings is, bar none, the most important literary work of modern fantasy ever published. Now, of course, there had been fantasy novels, many great ones, before Tolkien, but Lord of the Rings changed the landscape of fantasy publishing for all time. There are arguably very few authors working in high fantasy who have not engaged with and been influenced by Tolkien's trilogy, whether those authors are building upon its tropes, or simply copying them, or reinventing and subverting them. And you are either a fan of Lord of the Rings, or if you don't personally care for the books, you at least acknowledge their historical importance to the field. But the history of genre fantasy might have turned out very, very differently if it hadn't been for that time in 1965 when Lord of the Rings was pirated. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to this special episode of SFF180. Thomas here, your host, as always. Thank you so much for joining me. At the center of this fascinating drama is this man, Donald A. Wollheim. Born in New York on October 1st, 1914, Wollheim went on to have one of the most illustrious and important careers in all of SFF. His personal journey in science fiction dates all the way back to the earliest years of the Golden Age. He was a founder of the Futurians, a prominent fan group based in New York City that lasted from 1937 to 1945, and whose members included Isaac Asimov, Frederick Pohl, and Judith Merril. In October of 1936, Wollheim organized what is considered the very first, American science fiction convention in Philadelphia. There they are. Today we might just call that a meetup. Wollheim began his professional career, like most people at the time, by publishing short stories in the pulps. His debut story, The Man from Ariel, appeared in the January 1934 issue of Wonder Stories. Wollheim had to sue Hugo Gernsback to get paid, which makes everything I'm going to tell you here shortly especially ironic. Wollheim was an outspoken man in regards to his leftist politics, and it led to some lifelong feuds, most notably with the author James Blish, formerly a fellow Futurian. In 1939, Wollheim and several of his Futurian buddies were banned from the very first Worldcon because the convention chair belonged to a rival fan group, and I guess this was his way of owning the libs. It's as an editor and publisher that Wollheim became most prominent in the field. After paying his dues in the pulps, Wollheim founded Ace Books in 1952 and his own imprint, DAW Books, in 1972. At Ace, Wollheim created the Ace Doubles, which were two books in a single kind of flip-it-over edition, and these both established and boosted some of the field's major names, like Robert Silverberg, Roger Zelazny, Philip K. Dick, Samuel Delany, Ursula Le Guin, so on and so on. Even William S. Burroughs had his paperback debut, Junkie, released as an Ace Double. A copy of that in good condition might set you back a whole house payment. And it was also during Wollheim's tenure as the publisher of Ace Books that we come to today's story. In the early 1960s, mass-market paperbacks may have been wildly popular, but there wasn't much demand for fantasy, which it was thought just wouldn't sell. Wollheim disagreed and set out to get the U.S. paperback rights to The Lord of the Rings, a trilogy that was already for sale in hardcover in the U.S. from Houghton Mifflin Publishing, who are still publishing the hardcover editions of Lord of the Rings to this day. At the time, Houghton wasn't doing much to promote the trilogy, for reasons I'll discuss in a minute. So Wollheim contacted Tolkien to see about doing paperback editions, which Wollheim believed had huge potential. Possibly Wollheim thought Tolkien would be open to, even enthusiastic, about a paperback U.S. release that would win over the mass readership the trilogy deserved. He thought wrong. Tolkien forcefully rejected Wollheim's offer. Even though there had already been a UK paperback edition of The Hobbit in 1961, Tolkien vilified paperback books as a degenerate format and vowed that his trilogy would never be so debased. Wollheim, as a huge paperback champion, took that personally. In what has to be the ballsiest exercise in giving zero fucks in the history of SFF publishing, Wollheim got his hands on a copy of Tolkien's contract with Houghton Mifflin, studied it intensely, and discovered what he believed to be a loophole that would let Ace release the books. Turned out that all of the interior pages of the US hardcovers had been printed in the UK by Tolkien's publisher over there, and then those interiors were shipped over to the States, where Houghton just did their own binding and dust jackets. Based on US copyright law at the time, which admittedly had a lot of gray areas allowing for easy confusion and, shall we say, creative legal interpretations, Wollheim came to the conclusion that Tolkien's novels had no US copyright protection and were even public domain. And so Wollheim wasted no time releasing totally unauthorized mass-market paperbacks of Lord of the Rings with eye-catching primary color covers by popular pulp artist Jack Goen. They took off, quickly selling over 150,000 copies. Tolkien was not pleased. In order to secure a new US copyright, Tolkien made revisions to the books and then cut a paperback deal with US publisher Ian Ballantine. Ballantine had actually wanted to do paperbacks of Lord of the Rings for some time, and he already had a standing arrangement with Houghton Mifflin to do paperback releases of their hardcovers. But all this time he had been stymied by Tolkien's unwillingness to adopt the format. With that obstacle now obliterated by circumstances, Ballantine released the first of their fully authorized and totally legal mass-market Lord of the Rings editions with lovely Barbara Remington covers before the year was out, while Wollheim agreed to let the Ace editions, which were still selling like crazy, go out of print. Sales remained strong, and then Ballantine Books would eventually go on to launch j.r.r. Books, who are, to this day, the US mass-market publisher for all things Tolkien. So, what are all the ways in which Wollheim screwed up? Because screw up he did. And a 1993 court decision finally affirmed that his Ace editions were in fact in violation of copyright. Mostly it boils down to his mistaken assumptions about the legal status of the US hardcovers. Now, you'll remember I said that Houghton Mifflin had not been actively promoting their editions of Lord of the Rings. But the reasons had nothing to do with lack of proper copyright. It was not actually all that uncommon at this time for US publishers releasing stateside editions of books they'd acquired from the UK simply to have pre-printed interior pages shipped over, leaving them with just doing their own binding. It was kind of a cost-saving practice. But there were strict limits set by the federal government on how much quantity could be imported within a given year, and most sources that I've found indicate that Houghton had exceeded that limit, so it makes sense that they'd want to avoid any fines or other unwanted government attention by keeping the books low profile. Now you're probably asking if Tolkien just had to suck it up and accept getting ripped off by Wollheim, and happily I can tell you that's not the case. Once word got out about what Wollheim had done, fandom did what fandom usually does when someone has crossed a line. Now, since they didn't have social media yet, a letter-writing campaign was mobilized, and when Wollheim took the Ace editions out of print, he also paid Tolkien back royalties. So the most important fantasy saga of all time made its way to an American mass audience and eventually all around the world through a brazenly illegal act on the part of a headstrong man who didn't like being told no. But, I mean, naturally, the moral arguments against piracy, in particular, its financial impact on individual artists and creators, are all valid. But if Wollheim hadn't released his pirate editions, would Lord of the Rings have become the pop culture colossus it has since become? If Tolkien had just kept stubbornly holding out against paperbacks, might he have missed seizing the moment when it was his to seize? Or would some other author have broken through to mass-market fantasy fame instead, leaving Lord of the Rings to be one of the Johnny-come-latelys, bringing up the rear instead of being in the vanguard of fantasy's commercial rise? Perhaps, perhaps not, but it's fascinating to contemplate how unpredictably entire histories can turn. As they say, fools and pirates rush in where angels fear to tread. Eventually, everything turned out okay for everybody. In 1972, Donald Wollheim, together with his wife Elsie, founded DAW Books, the imprint that bears his initials, and under this imprint he easily restored his reputation and maintained his stature as a force in SFF publishing. At DAW, Wollheim allowed his authors greater room to innovate and push themselves to higher goals, to become storytellers with unique voices. DAW gave a number of authors from outside the US their first American releases, and it launched the careers of many of the next generation of SFF superstars, writers like Tanith Lee, Tad Williams, C.S. Friedman, C.J. Cherry. And when he needed to, Wollheim went to bat for his writers. When DAW's distributor refused to release the book How Are the Mighty Fallen by Thomas Burnett Swan for its queer content, Wollheim fought back and won. Finally, an author you might not be aware was also a Wollheim discovery was a young guy in the late 1970s named Robert Jordan. Jordan had submitted his first manuscript, Warrior of the Altai, to DAW, and Wollheim wanted it. But when Jordan asked for a few changes to his contract, and given Wollheim's history of being ethically sketchy, when it suited him, they were probably changes Jordan was wise to ask for, Wollheim withdrew the offer. But Jordan, who went on to become Robert Jordan, never held a grudge and always gave Wollheim respect for the excellent editorial guidance that he gave to a rookie writer. As time passed, the Tolkien controversy became a blip in his career, and by the time of his death in 1990, Donald Wollheim was hailed as one of the truly legendary figures in SFF publishing. And I have a faint but still clear memory of teenage Thomas meeting him briefly at a room party at the Atlanta Worldcon in 1986. And that is all I have time for on this episode of SFF 180. Thanks for joining me for this little trip down Fantasy's memory lane. So if you enjoyed watching, please hit that like button, share the video far and wide with all of your SFF reading friends, and above all, please subscribe. If you have not done so, that is how the channel grows. And you can also support the channel at my TeePublic store and at my Patreon, where recruits into Wink's Army get occasional little perks like early access to some of my videos, assuming I finish them on time. But mostly, the Patreon is there to help me pay Matt Olson, my brilliantly gifted, wonderfully talented channel artist, who does all of my amazing thumbnails and animations for me. So to those of you lending me Patreon support, thank you so much. It is greatly, greatly appreciated. And to all the rest of you, I want to say thanks for being the very best viewers in all of BookTube, and until I see all of you next time, please stay safe, stay healthy, and happy reading.